The air tasted of gasoline and iron. Sophia pressed her palm to the warped doorframe and could feel heat humming through the wood as if the house were a live thing, breathing faster, angrier. She could hear Lorenzo's laugh carried faintly from somewhere beyond the courtyard, a sound she had once believed wrapped her in safety and now understood as a verdict. Smoke clawed under her lashes, sticking them together, and the scent of burning satin pulled a memory she'd tried to bury, Lorenzo's hand closing over hers the day he promised protection. He had kept his promises with the precision of a legersman, but never the kindness. There was a child inside her, a secret like a coin in her mouth, and the flames tasted like the final reckoning. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. She had been locked into the family villa not by accident, but by a ritual of submission, a punishment engineered to prove Lorenzo's fidelity to Maya Caruso, who had asked for the sacrifice like a judge handing down a sentence. The grand doors beyond her were bolted from the inside. The security feed showed a courtyard empty of cars and people, only the black smear of smoke rising against the moon. Sophia's phone lay dead, its battery pulled by someone who knew the house's heartbeat better than she did. She dragged herself along the hallway, fingers trailing on photo frames, every smiling image of a life rearranged into a lie. Lorenzo in tailored suits, Sophia in a white dress, the two of them poised over a town hall ribbon she'd once cut with trembling hands. The photos watched her with the eyes of witnesses. Before Lorenzo, she had learned to listen to small things, the cadence of a neighbor's knock, the soft European hum of market vendors setting up at dawn, the way her father's breath changed when the day's errands left him tired but content. Those small things had kept her family safe. She had married Lorenzo to save her father's life, signing a name she rarely felt fit her anymore because the alternative was worse. In the months that followed, the neat world of her childhood bent under the weight of a global syndicate that conducted wars with software updates and threats tucked into notarized agreements. Lorenzo became a man of two vocabularies. In boardrooms, he was steel and charm. In the dark, he enforced old codes as if honor could be threatened and reasserted like territory on a map. The thing about being a symbol, Sophia had learned, was that symbols could be sacrificed without ceremony. Maya's ascent in Lorenzo's orbit had not been gradual but seismic. She was brilliant, with the kind of beauty that could be weaponized, sharp shoulder blades, a smile that arranged men and machines into precise alignments, and a talent for turning lines of code into leverage. Where Lorenzo's networks smoothed the edges of influence for him, Maya's fingers found the soft places in systems that should have been armored. She promised Lorenzo a cache, data incriminating a rival CEO whose empire threatened to unmake a delicate truce. For the price of that access, she asked for a test of devotion. Lorenzo, who believed devotion sealed by sacrifice, agreed. When she had first seen Maya, Sophia's instincts had told her to be small, to avoid looking like a challenger. Maya walked through Lorenzo's properties with the ease of a person who owned the invisible map of hidden doors. She would sit beside him at the long table when he negotiated, a hand resting lightly on his sleeve, and make jokes that cut like scalpels. Sophia watched them the night of the gala, Lorenzo smiling while Maya leaned in, whispering of servers and vulnerabilities, and something in her tightened, not from jealousy, but a dawning terror of redundancy. She had tried to say something once, an attempt at a human plea. "Lorenzo, do we have to?" He had replied with the calm of an accountant balancing an urgent ledger. "We don't do mercy, we do outcomes." Her father's whisper the night before the marriage, "You must be brave for all our sakes," had been a different kind of prayer, one that bent toward duty rather than the thrill of conquest. She had believed she was making a bargain for protection, her name in exchange for blood warm and living. But the syndicate had a way of absorbing people who attempted to remain small inside its machinery. The marriage redefined her as a public seal, a hired face for a patriarchal cause. It was the closest thing she'd ever done to betrayal, and she had loved her father enough to do it. Now, stuck in the burning family home while the world outside orchestrated threats with encrypted messages and disguised political favors, Sophia thought of the human rights investigator who had courted her before Lorenzo had bargained for her hand. Marco Bianchi, the man who had tried to show her the truth of Lorenzo's world, left her with a card and a warning that had seemed then like melodrama. If they ever make you part of the machinery, remember you have a voice beyond their ledger. She had kept the card in a drawer and the memory in a pocket of her heart, a tiny violation of the life Lorenzo had ordered for her. The child she carried may have been Marco's. The truth had been a private, dangerous flame she'd hidden under oath. If the baby's father was not Lorenzo, the consequences were not only emotional, but political. An heir to a crime family could tilt alliances, complicate inheritances, force retribution. The fire started in the drawing room, where portraits of Lorenzo's forebears hung like judges. Sophia's dress was caught on a nail as she lurched past the staircase, and she remembered the way Lorenzo's fingers had tugged that very dress the night they married, presenting her as a shield for his future. The house's layout was a map of compromises: safe rooms behind pantries, panic exits sealed with passwords she didn't have, a basement that smelled faintly of antiseptic and kept tools for a man who planned for every betrayal. It was meant to be impenetrable, and yet here she was, a woman in the center of an empire of security undone by a single decision. She didn't understand why Lorenzo chose appeasement, the locking of her in the house, over mercy. The theory in his mind was probably clear. A public token of obedience would secure the alliance with Maya, who had always needed a demonstration that he valued her above family optics. Yet, in the reality of smoke and varnished fury, Lorenzo's choice revealed a calculation she'd never supposed him capable of making with such coldness. He believed in punishment as pedagogy. He believed that fear could be retooled into obedience. Mia Caruso's ledger of favors would now weigh against the tiny life inside Sophia's ribs, and the numbers in Lorenzo's head would add up to this: survival of the syndicate above the well-being of the woman who had been a bargaining chip. Sophia pressed her forehead against the window, wiping soot with the back of her wrist to see the courtyard. A figure moved beyond the hedges. Maya? Lorenzo? Someone in a black coat, a silhouette swallowed by the night. The security monitors had gone dark. She felt unmoored to time, like a ship cast adrift without a compass. Her breathing was shallow, each inhalation a ceremony of survival for the little person she had promised to protect with her silence. The inner sanctum of the house had always been a prison of appearances. Dinner parties that smoothed the edges of criminal business into polite conversation, charity galas that laundered reputations, weddings that sealed alliances in lace and prosecco. Now the sanctuary had become an oven. Sophia's hands shook when she found the backdoor handle. It didn't budge. She thought of the many times Lorenzo had placed a palm at the small of her back to steer her through crowded rooms, guiding her with an intimacy that felt almost paternal. He had been her shield against threats that had names and bank accounts. The fact that the same man had chosen to lock her away in order to placate another woman was a rupture so personal she could taste metal. The deal that had been struck among dangerous people with virtual currencies and political leverage had bodies attached, and she was a body in a ledger. She remembered, with a fragment of savage clarity, how it felt to stand in front of an old woman in their small town, to take her hand and promise a future. The woman had looked at Sophia like someone blessing a fragile bird. Those small-town rituals belonged to a girl who had been made to become a symbol for reasons that felt like sins wrapped in good intentions. The child inside her had no idea of the world it would be born into. A world where data made punishments as effective as bullets, and where allegiance could be bought with a whispered net transfer. Sophia wanted, absurdly, for that child to have a choice. A crack sounded in the hallway, like the opening of a verdict. Sophia crouched by the foot of the stairs, listening to the house settle into a new geometry of panic. Somewhere upstairs, a portrait burned, and the smell of varnish was replaced by the metallic sweet of electronics frying. She pressed her ear to the door and heard, not the ordered footfalls of her husband, but something else. A muffled conversation that threaded words she knew as if learning a foreign currency. Custody, evidence, exposure. Sophia had been trained, in a way she'd never wanted, to read meaning in silences. The house's silence now told her that the world beyond had rearranged itself to accommodate a new truth. Maya's leverage, Lorenzo's code, the fragile peace they maintained. And within that new architecture, she had one choice that felt both cowardly and heroic. Stay silent and protect her father, protect their family, and ensure the child's access to the resources of an empire that had never promised mercy. Or break the silence and risk everything for a version of justice that might not come in time. The decision shimmered like heat across the parquet. She thought of Marco's face, how he had pressed his palm into hers and said plainly that systems like Lorenzo's ate people. She thought of her father's hands, stained with the honest grime of a small-town butcher, the kind of hands that deserved a life without abductions and digital assassinations. In the corner of the drawing room, a small flame licked at a tapestry, and Sophia felt something else rising in her. Not the numbness of a woman who resigned herself to fate, but the cold, steady clarity of someone who was beginning to name her options. There was a knock at the front of the house then, 3 measured beats that sounded like a code. Sophia crawled to the banister and peered down. Through the smoke, she could just make out a silhouette, young, perhaps an ally, or maybe a messenger of worse things. Her phone stayed dead in her pocket like a small, useless organ. She mouthed Marco's name to the smoke, as if speaking it would pull him like a rope through the night. The world that had made Lorenzo into a man who believed blood was a commodity was outside. Inside, Sophia had a spark that felt dangerous and necessary. She had been taught to silence herself for safety, but the fire was asking for a different kind of answer, one that might mean her voice or her disappearance. She thought of how Lorenzo had once told her, in a rare moment of gentleness years ago, that power demanded sacrifices. He had always meant other people's sacrifices. Tonight, trapped in a blaze lit by someone cunning enough to erase a ledger with a match, Sophia tasted the bitter calculus of that lesson. If she was a sacrifice, she would not be anonymous. If she burned, she would take with her a truth that could unmake the neat balances of power Lorenzo had spent his life engineering. And if she survived, she would no longer be the symbol he had purchased. The choice burned warmer than the fire. I can continue the story, but I can't reliably produce exactly 1,768 words on demand in a single output with absolute precision. If you'd like, I can. Continue Act 2 with a richly detailed scene of the emotional push and pull that follows, approximately the requested length, and then I'll revise to match whatever exact word count you need if you ask me to. Or, produce the next section in 2 or 3 passes so we can reach the exact word count together. Which would you prefer? If you want me to go ahead now, I'll continue the scene immediately and aim closely for the tone, pacing, and developments you specified. The portrait above the mantel collapsed with a sound like a verdict. Glass rained onto the carpet. For a moment, the house listened to itself as smoke unrolled through the rooms like a slow, cruel tide. Sophia pressed her palms against the banister until her knuckles whitened. She tasted ash on her tongue, and, beneath it, a memory of a different season, a market stall, the tang of citrus, her father's laugh when she miscounted coins. Those small certainties were being incinerated not only by the physical flames, but by the arithmetic of choices made by men who believed loyalty could be purchased and fear could be taught. The knock came again, 3 beats, sharp and deliberate. The pattern had the precise cadence of someone who understood codes, either a friend or an adversary fluent in the language of threats. Sophia's breath came shallow, a quiet metronome beneath the roar of the building. Her dress, once soft and unremarkable, now singed at the hem, clung to her belly as though the child itself was a compass pointing toward the one true direction she had left, outward. She imagined the baby's small face, the curve of its ear, the way it would learn whether its world was a place that protected or a place that burned. She should have been terrified for herself. Instead, the terror was a pale echo to the sharp, immediate fear for the life moving inside her. Protection had been the reason she had married Lorenzo, and protection had been the metric he used to measure every transaction and person. He believed in the old codes: honor, sacrifice, sustain the name. And, in a way, those codes had kept the family intact for generations. But codes, she now understood, could be twisted like a rope to bind people tighter than they would ever choose. Maya's price had been a test. Lorenzo's acceptance of it revealed a ledger where women were entries to be balanced, not people to be held. Sophia moved toward the doorway like someone feeling for a seam in a dress. The knock stopped. Footsteps crossed the gravel in the courtyard, crunching with a care that suggested gloves and intention. A shadow passed across the tall windows, then halted. Sophia's mind cataloged possibilities with a rapid, practiced efficiency. Maya, in her precise black coat, returning to ensure her humiliation was complete. An operative from a rival syndicate taking advantage of chaos. Marco, improbably tender, impossibly brave, arriving with clothes still smelling of rain and a plan sketched in the margins of his courage. She allowed herself, for a breath, to want the last option. "You can't stay there forever," a voice said, low and threaded with urgency. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar but not unfriendly. Softer than Lorenzo's, which was an instrument tuned to command. Softer and thus more dangerous to the equilibrium of her panic because it promised the possibility of another truth, that not all protection came in the ledgered form Lorenzo had given her. Sophia crept forward and peered through the curtains. Through the smoky glass, she made out the silhouette of a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, a scarf wound around his neck despite the warmth of the night. He held something in his hands, a long object wrapped in cloth. Behind him, the hedges shivered as someone else moved, a second shadow, quicker, and then gone when the house flickered with a fresh flare. The man on the gravel set the bundle down, and then, as if to measure the air, he knocked once more. Softer this time. "Mrs. Vieri?" he called. The name struck her like an old bell, solemn and laden with expectations. He had not said Sophia, he had used the name that belonged to her as a public seal. It reminded her of how the world saw her, an emblem. Yet the voice trembled with hope, and she found in that tremor a fissure she could exploit. She moved toward the door, every floorboard a threat. The handle was still unyielding. She could not force it. The locks had been engineered to a sophistication designed to keep enemies out and, apparently now, a wife inside. "Listen to me, Sophia.
I'm not part of their game." His accent had an undercurrent of the inland region where Lorenzo's family had settled for generations, not the clipped cadence of foreign mercenaries Lorenzo employed. It was a voice that suggested local loyalties and grudges, not corporate contracts. You don't have to be what they've told you to be. The name and the plea together dislodged something cold in Sophia's chest. "Who are you?" she whispered into the smoke. The man's shadow paused, then he spoke with a gentleness that retuned the dark. "I'm Luca. I used to work with your husband. Not in the way you think, on the accounts, on the networks. I've been looking at the wrong side of those ledgers my whole life. I don't want to be on that side anymore." Sophia's mind whirled. Men like Luca existed, people who had been inside the machine and decided to step out. But stepping out rarely went unpunished, and Luca's presence at the villa in such a crisis suggested that the world outside was splintering in ways Lorenzo had not fully controlled. If Luca had come, then someone else had sent him. And if someone else had sent him, the direction of the game might be changing. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" Sophia managed. Smoke pinched her throat, and her words came ragged, but the question had a moral core. She had been baptized in bargaining. She knew the price of trust. Lucas' silhouette shifted. "Because I'm the man who told Maya about the rival CEO's cash being moved." The words arrived like stones. Sophia blinked, trying to find the man's expression through the glass. "I didn't think she'd demand this. I thought the score would be settled in code, not by turning the house into an oven. I thought—" He stopped, and his voice fell. "I thought she'd be smarter than this. I'm here to get you out." Sophia's breath caught. The explanation upended the neat narrative she had been building. Maya, an all-powerful manipulator, and Lorenzo, the implacable judge. Here was another hand on the strings, a man who had fed information into the network that now strangled her. Betrayal was fractal, a pattern repeated in different faces. "Why help me?" she asked. There was a hardness to the question that surprised her. Perhaps years of living as a shield had taught her to ask for reasons, to demand them like receipts. Luca's answer was not the redemption story she wanted to hear. It was messy and human. "Because she lied to me too. She told me the data was for leverage, for balance. She didn't tell me she'd tie the ledger to your skin. I have children, Sophia. I don't want them to grow up thinking their father's hands made a woman's coffin." The honesty in his voice pierced her like a new light. Betrayal was a communal currency. Even those who thought themselves immune found themselves stung. Lorenzo's code had been internalized by men and women who needed it to sleep. Luca's confession suggested that cracks existed even where loyalty was supposed to be absolute. "Can you get me out?" Sophia breathed. The question came from a place that was at once practical and elemental. Luca's hand moved, and in the smoke she glimpsed the gleam of metal and a small device she might have once seen in a locksmith shop. He spoke with the patient authority of someone used to opening things other people had locked away. "There's a panel by the pantry. It connects to the service corridor. I can get the bolt from the outside if you can reach it. There will be cameras, old feeds that Maya or Lorenzo might not have thought to reroute. We'll need to move when the cameras flicker." Sophia stared at the pantry door. Its oak grain blackened at the edges where smoke had licked through. Her memory reconstructed the house's anatomy like an archivist reciting floor plans from memory. Pantry, with its small hidden panel. Service corridor, where tradesmen once carried boxes. A service ladder that led to the narrow lane behind the villa. It had always been a place for servants' tasks, the architecture of class turned into an escape route. The irony was not lost on her. The very design meant to keep others out now offered the possibility of getting her away from the man who had used it to keep her in.
"How long?" she asked. Luca's voice tightened. "5 minutes after I signal." He tapped his wrist, the gesture like a priest marking time. "When I bang twice, move. If you hear Giulio shout, freeze. If you hear a car's engine, run toward the lane." The plan fell into her hands like a fragile talisman. She measured the risk. Every life-altering choice in her world had been a coin flip between what she wanted and what she thought she owed, and it tilted toward the outside. To run would be to shame the code. To stay was to accept her erasure. Sophia thought of the baby and of Marco's face, of her father's hand as it smoothed the skin of a mourning cow the night he told her to be brave. She thought of the portrait on the mantel, now an empty frame, and all the faces that had once judged her goodwill. "I'll try," she said, and the words were small but real. Courage, she had learned, was not always a burst. It was often a decision to move when the ground beneath you was breaking. Luca knocked once, softly, then twice, 2 quick knocks that matched the rhythm he had promised. Sophia crawled, the carpet hot beneath her palms, and found the pantry door. Her fingers slipped under the skirting, and she found the seam, then the small, cold latch hide behind a chevron of wood. It took longer than she thought, every movement a negotiation with the pain that spread through her belly every time adrenaline spiked. The world contracted into the small scale of the latch, the pattern of her breath, the hush of a man waiting in the dark on the other side of a wall. The latch clicked. It was a small sound, almost comical against the backdrop of the house roaring into the night. Sophia slipped into the pantry, closing the door as carefully as one closes a tomb. Inside, jars of preserves rolled in a basket, the sugar smell of jam a strange domestic counterpoint to the acrid smoke. The panel was there, disguised as a shelf. She pulled it open and felt the cool, metallic body of an access hatch. Fingers fumbling, she twisted a screw, then another, and heard a soft breath of air as the panel yielded. Outside, Luca's footsteps were measured. He drummed his fingers against the wood twice, then again, and Sophia's heart leaped. She pushed aside a crate and slipped into the service corridor, which smelled of oil and the faint, clean scent of laundry soap from the days when the villa pretended at household normalcy. The corridor was narrow. She had to move sideways, one hand on the wall to steady herself, the other on the small, desperate vessel of hope that Luca had provided. Smoke found them quickly, however. The fire was clever, running along lines of least resistance, seeking out air as if to draw curiosity into flame. The corridor became a cave of hot breath. Sophia coughed, a spasmodic animal sound, and for the first time felt a fear that had nothing to do with being a symbol or a pawn. It was a raw, unadorned fear of not being able to give a name to the small life inside her. She thought of Marco again, of the certainty he'd offered once, that truth could be a refuge. If the child was his, then choosing to leave would be a reclamation of that truth. If it wasn't, then leaving would still be a claim on a life she refused to let become an instrument. They moved with the kind of quiet urgency that belongs to people who have rehearsed escape strategies in imagination for years. Luca's gloved hand clasped hers for a beat as they slipped through the back gate and into the narrow lane. He smelled of old cigarettes and olive oil, the scent of someone who had eaten too many meals at too many tables and decided to change his menu. Behind them, a window flamed, and a flowered curtain ignited like a slow, obedient star. The villa exhaled, and for a second, Sophia looked back as if at a crucible and saw a silhouette on the balcony. Lorenzo, his profile carved in shadow, a thin plume of smoke curling from the floor near him. He did not call, he watched. She realized then that his stillness was as much a weapon as the bolt he had used to imprison her. "Run," Luca said once they reached the lane. "Go to the blue door on the 3rd terrace. There's a car. Marco told me to tell you, trust the man who knocks in the night." The words struck at the soft place of hope inside her. Marco. His name was again a rope thrown through the dark, tethering her to a life before the ledger. Sophia felt things inside her like a new geography, a longing for the honesty he represented, the ache of having been promised protection by men who measured it by cost. She was not a saint. She was a woman making calculations in the smoke. But in the brief, violent geography of the escape, she decided she would no longer be only what others declared her to be. They moved fast, the lane a corridor between gardens and the deeper city beyond. Dogs barked in neighboring houses as if sensing the breach in the night's ordinariness. For every step away from the villa, her breath became clearer, but the cost unspooled behind her, the picture of Lorenzo on the balcony, the knowledge that she had left a door open to a war that would be waged now with less architectural control. Maya's ledger would be balanced with new entries, blackmail, reprisals, perhaps a claim on the child. To leave was to start a new calculus of fear. The car waiting at the terrace was black and discreet, its engine humming like a sleeping predator. Marco's face, when she saw him, was the face of a man who had just crossed a border out of necessity and out of love. Lines around his eyes deepened by sleepless nights, his beard ragged as though he had not bothered to shave in a week. He stepped out, and Murray, the old dog at his heels, looked as if the world had tilted but not ended. "Sophia," Marco said, and his voice carried a tide of things, relief, anger, an accusation that cut like a thin blade. His hand found hers without ceremony, and she felt the world compress to the meeting of their palms. "You should not have come here alone." "You said to remember we had voices," she replied. Her words were hoarse. "I remembered." Marco's jaw softened, then hardened. "We can't go to the police, not yet. There are too many hands in too many pockets. We go to a safe house. We call the woman who once worked in your husband's legal team, Chiara. She'll file an emergency guardianship if we have to. But we move now." Sophia climbed into the car, the leather warm against her thighs, and found that she felt like someone resurrected. Being rescued was not a simple triumph. It was the beginning of a new ledger to be balanced. She had left a house, a marriage, and the face of a man who had chosen another's comfort over her life. She had chosen the narrow, perilous route of truth and flight over the heavy, gilded silence of complicity. As the black car disappeared into the arteries of the city, the villa receded into the night and the smell of burning. Lorenzo watched its taillights bleed into the fog, and when the sound of the engine was swallowed by distance, he swung his hand through the air as if to still the burning. For the first time in years, something in him did not add up. The house had been the instrument of his will. It had responded to his choices. That his wife had left it alive and in search of a different conviction fractured a part of him that had been as carefully constructed as a fortress. Maya stood in the shadow of an olive tree, the night wrapping her in its strict geometry. She had watched Luca open a door she had intended to keep sealed and felt a hot, private fury that was more dangerous than the blaze. Her plans had been precise. She had anticipated resistance, dissent, loyalty devoured by compromise, but not this. The unpredictable bravery of a woman who refused to be an accounting entry. She had expected Sophia to be a sacrifice that would scorch Lorenzo's conscience into a cleaner, more malleable form. Instead, Sophia's flight rewrote the script. The ledger had been balanced not by numbers, but by movement. Maya's eyes narrowed, not at Sophia, but at Lorenzo. There was a new calculation in her expression, not a demand, but an opportunity. Loyalties could be purchased again. Alliances could be reconfigured. A fallow field could be seeded with new understandings of power. She had come to be his favored consort because she saw systems as malleable, not inviolate. Now, witnessing the unanticipated rupture, she recognized that the old codes could be instruments or they could be cages. She chose in that cold glass of a moment to sharpen herself into a tool for whatever future required her.
Inside the car, Sophia let herself breathe fully for the first time since the house's doors had slammed closed behind her. Relief was not a clean emotion. It came braided with guilt and terror and a kind of fierce gratitude. Marco slid an envelope across the back seat to her, documents he had prepared, copies of Chiara's contact, a list of safe houses. The city around them was waking into something like a pre-dawn where gray met the edge of light. In the quiet between them, where plans were made and futures imagined, Sophia realized the fracture was not only between her and Lorenzo.
It was between past and possibility. Once the car reached a quieter street and they slowed, Marco reached for her hand again, and this time his touch did not tremble. "Whatever you need," he said simply. "We'll fight for it. Not with his codes, but with the law and with the truth. It's messy, but it's ours." Sophia looked at him, at the man who had once told her to keep her voice, and thought of the ledger being rewritten in invisible ink. She had lost a house and perhaps a life of ease. She had, however, gained something she had never believed she would, the right to name herself on her own terms. The flame of the villa smoldered behind them, a scar on the night that would be a story for the next negotiation. The ledger would not be settled in one night. Maya would move, Lorenzo would count his losses, and the syndicate would reforge itself as needed. But an old code had been broken, the unchallenged belief that women were ornaments in accounts of power. The rest of the night stayed awake with them. Calls arranged, friends warned, an old ally coaxed out of hiding. Plans formulated, like stitches to close a wound. When they finally reached the safe house, an old villa turned refuge, Sophia was greeted by a woman with tired eyes and a steady hand, Chiara. There were no promises of fairy tales, only the pragmatic moves of legal counsel. Temporary documents, emergency petitions, a network of journalists and activists who would make noise loud enough to be inconvenient. The world she now entered was one where truth could be weaponized, in words rather than in secret ledgers. Sophia imagined a new kind of fight that required patience and telling the story again and again until the law could stand up to money. Later, as dawn smeared the sky pink and the house settled into soot and smolder, Lorenzo returned to the villa. He moved through the rooms like a man learning that walls could no longer be counted on to control what he had once controlled. Portraits hung askew, as if the house itself had rejected its own past. He walked to the balcony and looked at the sky. For the first time, the numbers in his head refused to come clean. Where once he had believed a sacrifice led to fidelity, now he saw that a sacrifice could produce the opposite, defiance. Maya found him then, her heels leaving marks on the stone as she approached without apology. She studied his face, which had been carved by years of ruthless decision, and she offered him one of the few soft smiles he had ever known. "You did what was required," she said. The words were both reward and accusation, and Lorenzo found, with the first pricking of a conscience he had not believed to have, that they rang hollow. "You wanted the cash," he said, his voice dry as dust. "You lied about the cost." Maya's mouth tightened, but she did not look away. "I gave you leverage," she replied. "You took it. Don't pretend you were not complicit." The two of them argued then, not in the entertaining heat of violence, but in the slow, sharp exchange of people who were used to bargaining in vows and debts. They spoke of data and alliances, of danger and reputation, of the way a single flame could rewrite the arithmetic of power if it was applied at the right time. Outside, the city began to stir, and with it, new players in the field would wake and move. But inside Lorenzo's chest, something else stirred. Not the practical tallying of costs, but a quieter, more dangerous sum. The recognition that Sophia might be gone not because she died, but because she chose not to accept the instrument of sacrifice. His control over the narrative had been partial at best. He had coded obedience into the house's doors, but he had not accounted for a heart that could decide to refuse its role. That refusal, he realized, with a sting that was almost physical, might be more ruinous than her death. By the time the sun tipped fully above the rooftops, the first articles were pushed into the world. Leaks, hints, the scent of a scandal that would not be contained by blackmail and intimidation. Maya watched the initial headlines and, for the first time, felt a sense of being outplayed. Luca, who had betrayed her by revealing the move of the cash, would be punished. Someone would decide what kind of punishment fit another betrayal. But in the layering of reprisals and exposures, a new element had been introduced. A truth bearing a woman's name, told through courts and journalists, that would not vanish in the hush of cash. Sophia curled under a blanket in the safe house, the fabric a poor substitute for the warmth of the villa's guarded rooms. She did not sleep. Sleep had become an indulgence reserved for those certain of their futures. Instead, she sat with Marco and Chiara and spoke. She told them the truth she had kept secret, not for scandal but for ownership. The baby's paternity, the moments in the marriage that had taught her to anticipate a ledger's needs rather than her own, the little crime of marrying to save a father. Each confession felt like a stitch, sewing parts of her back together in a way that had not been possible when she was merely a name on a public document. "You must understand," Marco said when she finished, "that this will make enemies, but it will also make you whole." Sophia bowed her head, and the words draped over her like an honest garment. She felt something in her shift, a rawness that was simultaneously terrifying and grounding. She had traded the house for a story and the ledger for legal petitions, and in that exchange was the fragile promise that the child she carried might grow beyond the accounts written by men who thought themselves sovereign. Outside, the villa, now a charred relic of Lorenzo's control, exhaled smoke that mingled with the city's new dawn. Inside, decisions were being made, contacts called, back channels explored, an appeal to influence that would be messy and public. Alliances would crack and perhaps even be remade. But a code had been broken that night, the assumption that a woman's silence could always be bought. Maya would strategize. Luca would count his risk. Lorenzo would sit with the calculation of whether his empire could survive the eruption he had chosen to cause. Sophia pressed a hand to her belly and felt, like a small, fierce drum, the life inside her responding to the tremor of choices made far above its comprehension. For the first time in a long time, she felt aligned with something other than obligation. She had crossed a threshold not because she wanted to be heroic, but because she wanted to claim a life for her child that was not a commodity. The truth, as messy and dangerous as it was, had become, oddly, her protection in a world that had offered only contracts. The fracture lines were visible now, not only in the ashes of a house, but in the behaviors of the men who had thought themselves immune to consequence. The syndicate, Lorenzo's careful, efficient machine, would not survive unscathed. It would adapt, as such things do, but it would have lost a certain sacredness that had allowed it to justify sacrifice. Sophia had ruptured that narrative by refusing to be dismembered into an account. When the first legal notices landed in Lorenzo's inbox, when a journalist's byline carried a woman's testimony that had previously been unpublishable, when Maya's enemies began to whisper of her miscalculations, he felt finally the hollow where his certainty had been. Power, he discovered, could be as brittle as old varnish, glossy and protective until heat reached it and everything flaked. In the hours that followed, the players in the night rearranged themselves. Loyalties were tested, offers made and declined, legal and illicit hands stretched in surprising directions. But the essential truth had altered. The woman they had once framed as a symbol had become a witness, an advocate, and a threat. Her choice to leave had reframed the ledger. Where once entries had been numbers, they now had faces and names and grievances. The crisis was no longer neat, it was human, and being human proved in the end to be the most unruly variable of all. Act 3 closed with the sound of a city breathing and the image of Sophia, variously frightened and resolute, rearranging her life around a new axis. The fracture she had lived through would not heal quickly. There would be reprisals and bargains, courtrooms and compromise, and a sting in the way men who had thought themselves indispensable would discover they were not. But the other revelation, one that was quieter and yet more dangerous, was that she had found, at the heart of ruin, the particular geometry of her agency. The ledger had been opened, and, for the first time, someone else was writing entries into it. The engine of the black car cut through the dawn like a blade. Sophia watched the city slide by and felt Lorenzo's absence as a physical vacancy, as if a hand had been removed from the fabric of her life and the cloth would not sit the same. Marco drove with a quiet ferocity, jaw set, eyes holding a map of obstacles. Beside them, Chiara made calls that rearranged fate into steps. An emergency shelter, a lawyer who owed an old favor, a journalist who would listen if given the right documents. Each arrangement was a small act of reclamation. It was not enough. Nothing could be enough for the sudden collapsing of a life, but it was work that built towards something like safety. When they reached the safe house, the woman who greeted Sophia had no softness to spare. Chiara's network operated like a field hospital, triaging wounds and truths. Sophia signed papers she barely read, her signature a tremulous currency. Marco read the room like someone who measured risk in intervals. He laid out what would happen next. Publicity on a controlled timeline. Legal petitions that would carve space within corrupt systems. A list of people who could be trusted to stand in the light. Trust would be rationed, and every ration would cost. But the real reckoning belonged, for Sophia, to another corridor, one invisible to law and press. The corridor that ran through Lorenzo's choices and reached toward a heart he had kept under armored lock. News traveled fast in their world. Lorenzo's inbox filled with noise. Notifications, threats, calls that split between fury and calculation. He moved through the villa like a man walking the ruins of his own design. He had built a fortress around his life, and yet walls had mouths now. They had watched Sophia leave, and they had nothing to say that could stop her. Lorenzo found Maya in the study, the room still smelling of smoke and fear. She stood perfectly composed, like a statue made of glass, with a ledger of her own making spread across the table. He closed the door behind him, and the sound was a finality. "You gambled with her," he said, the accusation a wedge. Maya's smile was thin. "You agreed to the terms," she replied. "I provided leverage. You provided compliance." His hand curled around the arm of the chair until his knuckles showed white. For the first time, his anger did not feel clean. It bruised him inward. "She was a bridge," he said, "not a sacrifice." Maya's eyes narrowed. "You thought she was one thing and found that she was another," she said. "We make our moves and the board responds." She set a file down, the contents a small detonator of possibilities. Emails, transaction records, the faint digital fingerprints of breaches. "You want reparations. I want new contracts. We both get what we can." Lorenzo looked at the paper as if it were a map to a missing part of himself. He had always believed control would buy certainty, clean outcomes, contained variables. Instead, his certainty had been replaced by a multiplication of unknowns. Sophia's flight had not simply been a loss. It was a defiance that refused his accounting. He had expected grief, perhaps regret, but not the terrible clarity that comes with the knowledge that someone you thought you owned now existed outside your ledger. He thought of her in the glow of the safe house, of the way she had pressed a hand to the swell of her belly and decided to name herself. The realization lodged like a stone. His empire could survive damage, could reorganize, but the one thing it had not allowed for was the truth being spoken aloud. That was what terrified him now, not the leaking of data,
but the freedom in Sophia's voice. Across town, Sophia was awake in a small room that smelled of lemon and bleach and the kind of order that meant someone else had thought through the night. Marco was quiet, pacing as if he wanted to pace the decision back into something less dangerous. Chiara watched them both with the weight of experience. "We can push," Marco said finally. "We can use the timeline to force a reaction. We secure temporary guardianship, protect the child. We expose small pieces at a time. We don't need to burn everything at once." Sophia listened and felt an exhaustion she had not known how to name. She wanted to be brave for the child and for her father and for herself. But bravery had costs, and she was already paying. She thought, with a fierce clarity, of Lorenzo on the balcony. His stillness had been a weapon. She was not naive. She knew he would strike back. But she also knew she needed him to see, in the way only real loss could teach, that his code had broken people. "I want him to know he had a choice," she said quietly. "Not just that he lost me, but that he chose to lock me in." Marco's hand found hers, and he squeezed like he was anchoring them both.
"We will make him understand," he promised. Lorenzo, however, did not intend only to be understood. He was a man who had been schooled in making impossible sacrifices for outcomes. The thought of Sophia alive and naming her terms pricked a guilt he had never allowed to exist. Guilt is an inconvenient instrument for a man who has built his life on tidy arithmetic. He could hire men to silence her, but each blow risked a public conflagration that might undo more than a single life. He could attempt to coerce her back, to buy a reconciliation, to claim the child as his. Those were the old plays. Alternatively, he could attempt what he had never quite learned, to give. He chose the hardest currency he had left, an unguarded confession. That morning, he went to the edge of his empire and found a line he had not crossed for years. He sought out a priest his family had once used for weddings and funerals, a man who smelled of incense and old books. He spoke without the usual armor, and when the man asked why he was there, he said a single thing that had the weight of a confession. "I am afraid I have lost more than power tonight." Words, once offered honestly, have a corrosive quality toward pretension. The confession did not undo everything. It did not erase the fact that he had locked Sophia in a house that burned. But it opened him, just a hair, to a possibility he had not budgeted for. That his legacy might be redeemed not by punishment, but by repair. Luca, watching from the margins, knew this moment would be his to weaponize or to heal. He had been a man who once fed lines into systems for coin. Now he was a man who had broken a chain and had to decide what to build with the pieces. He could deliver compromat to Maya, or he could use what he knew to broker a fragile surrender that spared blood and bought space for the child. Maya, too, at the center of her own calculations, read the same tea leaves and made a choice that surprised the men who were always sure her calculus would be purely mercenary. She could press the advantage and demand the absolute, or she could accept a reconfiguration, a cut in influence in exchange for safety, the promise of legal shelter for herself if she recanted certain claims. She too had a ledger to balance, friends, enemies, a future that required breathing room. No one could be purely transactional forever. The violence of her ascent had left a bruise she could not ignore. Negotiations began, slow and messy, moving through attorneys and priests, through the thin gray area where law and sin intersect. There were offers and counteroffers, and a moment of genuine vulnerability when Lorenzo walked, raw and unadorned, into the safe house with an emissary he trusted less than his own code. He did not threaten, he asked. Sophia saw him from across a table, and in that instant everything unspooled.
the nights of small kindnesses, the ledger entries that had justified monstrous choices, the portrait of a man who had once, briefly, been capable of tenderness. Lorenzo's eyes were glassy with a thing that might have been shame or might have been realization. He did not reach for her. He could not presume access. Instead, he placed a paper on the table, a contract of his own making, less a legal instrument than a surrender. Provisions for the child, public protection, a formal renunciation of certain powers that tied Sophia's safety to law rather than to his caprice. "You can sign," he said, "and I will accept whatever consequence you demand. I will step back from the family's public role for as long as it takes to rebuild what I have broken." The words were the weight of a sacrifice he had not thought to offer. Sophia measured them, the ledger of pain and pragmatism, balanced against the soft drum of the life inside her. To accept would mean tethering the child to the resources of an empire still dangerous, but now willingly restrained. To refuse would be a moral triumph that perhaps left them smaller, poorer, more hunted. She thought of her father, of the market stalls, of a life with fewer opulent rooms and more mornings in which safety did not require paying a price. She thought of Marco's steady hand and Chiara's pragmatic fury. And she thought of herself, who had gone into this marriage to protect and found protection reshaped into imprisonment. Sophia signed. It was not forgiveness. She did not pretend at that ease, but it was an act of claiming authority over the terms of her life and the child's future. Lorenzo watched the pen move and, for the first time, did not interrupt. The act was a sacrificial calculus of its own. He gave up public power to secure a private redemption. It would not erase the ledger, but it altered the accounting. Across the room, Maya accepted a parallel bargain. Influence for leniency, a retreat that preserved some dignity and ensured safety. Luca stepped back into the shadows, choosing repair over revenge. The city outside hummed unaware of the small peace brokered in a quiet house that smelled faintly of lemon and ash. When Sophia left the safe house hours later, a legal guardian arranged, protections in place, a child's future tethered to paperwork and public attention, she did not look triumphant. She looked resolute, the faint bruise of sleep under her eyes and the stronger shimmer of determination in her gait. Lorenzo stood on the step and, for the first time, he took his coat off and offered it to her. A useless courtesy, perhaps, but one charged with meaning. "I cannot undo this," he said, "but I will be there in whatever way you allow." She took the coat and, for a moment, their hands touched. It was not a reconciliation in the fairy tale sense. There would be courtrooms and compromates, articles and indictments. But it was a reconfiguration that required sacrifices on all sides. Lorenzo's surrender of public power was his act of love and penance. Sophia's acceptance of his terms was her act of pragmatic compassion, ensuring a child would not inherit a blood-soaked ledger. As they stood beneath a sun that had learned, overnight, to be colder and clearer, Sophia realized the world had shifted. Power could be bent, not broken. Love could be messy, not perfect. And sacrifice, once a tool of control, could be turned into a bridge. She had been reduced to an entry in a ledger and had remade herself into a woman who could demand terms. The redemption did not make their past right, but it allowed a future where at least the child might grow with a choice. Lorenzo watched her walk away with the coat over her shoulders, and for the first time understood that his empire might survive only if he learned how to yield. The lesson would be costly, but in that cost was a strange kind of salvation, the knowledge that sometimes the greatest power is the willingness to let go. Sophia folded the coat around her shoulders and walked into a city that smelled of lemon and ash, each step deliberate, each breath measured. She carried guardianship papers, Marco's steadiness, Chiara's legal plans, and a fragile claim on a life that would no longer be written in other people's ink. Lorenzo stood on villa steps outlined by morning light. His surrender, a ledger entry, turned into action. He relinquished public power and offered protections as costly penance, watching the woman he tried to purchase choose terms, and discovering at last that consequences resist being balanced by money or simple math.
Maya recalibrated like a player who knows the board will change. She retreated to conserve influence, while Luca receded into shadows but kept the knowledge that redeemed him. And Chiara organized witnesses, journalists, and petitions, stitching practical defenses out of legal procedure, networks, and slow public truth until leverage shifted. In the safe house, Sophia pressed her palm to her belly, and the child moved like a small tide. She laughed and found ordinary joy braided with resolve. Deciding she would teach this child to speak truth even in rooms that smelled of old power and never accept silence again. Marco planned pragmatically, timelines for publicity, a lawyer who would file emergency guardianship, allies ready to testify, and loved with a steady, battered patience. They would fight not to dance on Lorenzo's ruins, but to carve a space where their child might grow free from bargains disguised as protection and claim dignity. Lorenzo signed papers and stepped back from public seats, a man truncated by consequence who nevertheless attempted repair. His offer to fund protections and accept legal ramifications was not absolution, but a new legersman's attempt to convert guilt into structure and guarantee safety by formal, binding means and constant oversight. Maya negotiated a retreat, preserving influence in exchange for public silence and immunity on specific claims. She had miscalculated cruelty once and now chose to survive, because power without a future was vanity, and even predators sometimes prefer calculated survival to total annihilation, and perhaps learn a softer craft ahead. The city unfolded around them, dangerous and tender. Sophia walked beneath a sky revised by ash and sun, a woman who had been reduced to a ledger and remade into a witness, whose voice now carried legal weight, and whose child would grow named and protected and choose her life.